Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jan Szrewiński. Ahead of the upcoming general elections, Viktor Orbán has doubled down on his EU-skeptic anti-Ukrainian narratives as he struggles to maintain public support. And with charges now being pressed against Budapest's opposition mayor, Gergely Karácsony, over his role in organizing a major LGBT event in Budapest, it appears Orbán is pulling no punches. But as Peter Magyar's TISA party remains on the rise, is Budapest likely to see a major political shift despite Orbán's efforts? Joining us here today is Daniel Hegedüs, Regional Director of the Transatlantic Trust Central Europe. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning and thank you for having me.
So let's begin with the latest news, shall we? The mayor of Budapest, affiliated with the opposition, now faces charges over an event that he helped organize. What does it tell us about the approach that Orbán and his government is now taking?
Yes, this is obviously a very significant escalation in the election campaign, and I think it represents a very desperate attempt by the governing party, Fidesz, actually to regain control over the public narrative and agenda in the election campaign. The opposition party, Respect and Freedom, TISA, has been really successful during January with the repeated announcement of its candidate to the ministerial positions in a potentially new democratic Hungarian government. So has been really successful in controlling that agenda. Fidesz has been actually only a secondary player in waving the narratives, and this is obviously a very, very dangerous situation to the incumbent party when actually all of the independent pollster agencies measure a two-digit or double-digit advantage for the opposition party. So they use every single attempt and opportunity to regain a potential control, and the legal prosecution of Mayor Karácsony, and also the charges that there is potentially an organized cooperation between TISA party and Ukrainian authorities serve exactly that role.
Now, speaking of which, these are some major accusations there concerning Ukraine. The Ukrainian ambassador has been summoned to the foreign ministry, and we have open statements that Ukraine is interfering in the vote because they have a vested interest. Now, to what extent these accusations can be considered to have any basis in facts?
I am not a political player, but I think it's fair to say that these accusations are completely made up. And what we know about the policy position of the opposition party TISA with regard to Ukraine, then we can only state that these positions are very cautious and does not represent an openly supportive positions towards the eastern neighbor of Hungary. Even in case of a TISA government, I think there could be only a very cautious and slow change in the overall foreign policy positions of Hungary, even with regard to the potential EU accession of Ukraine, and providing military support wouldn't be among the political options, even in case of a new government. So with an eye on all of these positions, I think it's fair to conclude that these are empty accusations made up by the Hungarian governing party, and I need actually to emphasize that these are not new. These narratives, these tools were repeatedly used actually by the propaganda of the Hungarian governing party over the past 6 to 9 months. So obviously, the closer we come to the April 12 elections, the more significant these accusations appear to be, but they do not represent any new tool or new measure in the communication landscape of the Hungarian campaign.
So Viktor Orbán also claims that the victory of the opposition would almost automatically mean drawing Hungary into an unspecified war. He suggests that, for example, Hungarian troops could be drafted into the army and later on sent into Ukraine to perform some sort of combat operations. Now, what would you say about these claims? Because they form one of the major themes in Orbán's narrative. Like, the current government, we stand for peace. The other party, the opposition, they stand for war. And they try to frame it as something as simple as that.
Yes, which is practically a repetition of the successful 2022 election campaign. And I wouldn't like to sound unserious, but I think we can narrow down in the main communication strategy of Fidesz into a single sentence. They are messaging to the Hungarian voters that either you select us or the end of the world will be coming. And through this lens, I think we can realize what's the relationship between this communication narrative or propaganda narrative and actually the reality. There is no talk in most of the Central and Eastern European countries to send troops to Ukraine, even as part of the peace guarantees after a potential ceasefire or peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia. Hungary certainly won't be part of that. And again, I can only repeat what we know about the foreign policy propositions of TISA party and its policy positions with regard to Ukraine. It's out of question that they could even consider to make such moves anytime in the future.
Now, let's talk about a statement that is both ominous and rather enigmatic. That was made by Viktor Orbán quite recently. He said, I see no other solution than to accept that NATO and the European Union cannot be located directly on Russia's borders because the Russians will always respond to that with war. If we assume this to be true, what ramifications would it have to the continent as it is today?
Again, apologies if that sounds unserious, but with regard to that statement, we can, on the one hand, conclude that that Prime Minister Orbán is not necessarily aware of certain geographic realities within Europe today, that, for example, to the Kaliningrad enclave, Russia is directly neighboring EU and NATO member states, for example, also Poland. Notwithstanding this, what we hear in this case is nothing else, just a repetition of that Russian narrative that used to be with us actually since the late 90s and the first Eastern enlargement of NATO, that there was a promise that NATO won't enlarge in the Eastern direction. And in this case, the Prime Minister of a NATO and EU country uses that narrative to strengthen and support the discursive position of Russia. And in this case, again, we can ask the same question, what we could do over the past couple of years, which is actually in which team Prime Minister Orbán is playing in this very sensitive geopolitical moment, which can have such far-reaching consequences for the future of Europe. Through the war in Ukraine and also through the hybrid and also conventional military threat that Russia is posing to a couple of EU and NATO member states in Central and Eastern Europe.
Do you think that this is only about the natural resources? One of the main arguments given in support of Orbán is that, well, he doesn't have any other choice, because if Hungary is deprived of energy resources from Russia, then it has no way to function as a relatively prosperous society, economic problems aside, obviously. But doesn't this go slightly beyond this, what would be expected if Viktor Orbán wanted to prove to Vladimir Putin that he is not an enemy, he is someone that can, bridge the gap between Russia and the European Union and so on? Adopting these narratives seems to be something more. At least some people say, well, this is not just about the natural resources.
It's primarily not about the natural resources. The case of Czechia is proving that you can phase out the fossil energy import from Russia while actually maintain a competitive economy. The Hungarian economy is not competitive and it's not growing, even with its reliance on cheap Russian energy import. Please allow me just to use one example. Hungary used to have the second largest GDP per capita in the early 2000s in the V4 group, second only to Czechia. Currently, after more than 16 years or almost 16 years of government under Prime Minister Orbán, Hungary has the lowest GDP per capita in comparison to the other Central European countries. It's telling that Russian cheap energy is not used actually to create a competitive economy in Hungary. The partnership with Russia and actually following a similar pattern, also the close connections to Donald Trump actually have only one purpose, and it is to be able to maintain an autocratizing regime in a democratic community of the European Union with the help of external support of great powers, some of which are authoritarian, like actually China or Russia, some of which pose direct security threat to the European Union, because as a highly corrupt and autocratizing regime, without that external support and without actually the autonomy at the international stage, Prime Minister Orbán wouldn't necessarily be able to remain in power. And actually, we will be able to see after the April 12 elections whether that external support and whether that ties to the Kremlin, to the current Trump administration and also Beijing were satisfactory in order to be able to remain in power.
Daniel Hegedüs was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Jan You're watching TVP World. Please just stay with us.